They were not rock, they were not jazz, they were not country, they were not classical. But they had facets of all of that in their music. And when you put all of those facets together, what you get is this really amazing pop gem.
Why do boats suddenly appear every time you are near? Just like me, they long to be close to you.
The Carpenters made exquisite music, sublime music, which, if you're in the right mood, is just a level above. I think also anyone who's had a bad day in their love life and having a bit of a heartbreak situation, I think the Carpenters are going to be among the first records they reach for to have a damn good wallow.
Carpenters are supremely gifted purveyors of middle-of-the-road adult music for the lonely and the broken-hearted.
Without you.
What the Carpenters did was that they sort of changed the notion of what a cover song was, because those songs suddenly became theirs.
And oh, so far away, I fell in love with you before the second show.
The Carpenters, in my mind, are rather like ABBA were a few years later, you know, in the sense that they are both absolutely brilliant composers of modern pop song.
But you're not really here. It's just the radio. Don't you remember you told me you loved me, baby? You said you'd be coming back this way again, baby. Baby, 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 oh baby, I love you, I really do.
Carpenters were a curious beast, really, because as siblings, they had a reasonably well-off background. They didn't sort of, they weren't a classic case of bohemian artists who struggled to begin with, and they had music lessons. They were, trained musicians, this kind of thing. Both very versatile musicians.
Richard Carpenter was like this little child genius, playing piano at a really, really early age. He was interested in classical music, big band music, jazz music, everything you can imagine. He became a pop music obsessive. He's one of these people who knows everything, knows how to do everything, knows how to play everything. He's just sort of lived and breathed music from the age of maybe 3, whereas Karen took up drums when she was 14, 15 in high school and hadn't really shown any huge aptitude for music up to that point, and didn't really think too much of her own voice at that time either.
Well, they were like so many other bands of the 60s in that there were many sort of different combinations before they found the one that worked. They were a trio, a jazz trio to start out with, and then at one point Karen had a solo deal of her own, and then there was this larger group called Spectrum that Richard was the head of, Karen and Richard and 5 or 6 or 4 or 5 of their friends. So now we're getting into the sort of later 60s. And all of them sort of made a little bit of noise locally in California. I mean, I think the trio had a deal with RCA at one point and nothing really came of it. And Karen put out a few solo singles on her own. So they were just sort of doing what every act did, really, that was really committed to making it work, trying to find the right combo that worked. And finally, by 68 or 69, it was just the two of them, and Richard got this idea to overdub their voices so that it sounded like a group, even though it was just the two of them. And they both had vocal training so they could do this 4-part harmony, and then they would overdub it in the studio a few times. And so that was the combination that finally got the deal with A&M in '69.
The thing about A&M Records at this time was that while all the other labels were signing up groups connected to the Summer of Love and the psychedelic rock experience, Herb Alpert wanted his label to be something very different to that. He had classy songwriters at his label. He had Bacharach and David. He signed the Carpenters because he thought, firstly, that the arrangements and the harmonies were absolutely fantastic, and secondly, because he saw that they were a classic band who could endure for a long time and not one of the rock bands. He did not want to compete with all of that was going on. So they were something very, very different to what the prevailing rock climate was.
The debut did quite well. It was it had Ticket to Ride on it, which was a really excellent cover of the Beatles song, and it brought a whole new kind of gravitas to Ticket to Ride, which was a standard Beatles pop song. Very good one, of course, but the Carpenters turned it into something really kind of over the top and mournful and melancholy. And eventually the album was repackaged and retitled Ticket to Ride when that took off and started to get radio play.
I wouldn't say that first album was one of their better albums by any stretch of the imagination. It's not one that yielded any great hits. The thing that people do remember is that they treated Ticket to Ride to a very, very, very different arrangement, and from there got their break.
He's got a ticket to ride. He's got a ticket to ride. He's got a ticket to ride. And he don't care.
When the Carpenters did covers like Ticket to Ride and Help, they sort of did something in reverse too. When rock groups would take these standards and give them a rock treatment, it was very original and very shocking to the people who knew the originals. So Ticket to Ride and Help, which are kind of rock numbers, they did almost like chamber music. So they went the other way with them. And again, it was the same outrage and scandal, but that outrage and scandal was coming from rock fans who said, how can you turn Help into this church song?
And now my life changed in so many ways. My independence seems to vanish in the haze. And every now and then I feel so insecure. I know that I need you like I've never done before.
They were always covering Beatles songs. They loved the Beatles. And I just don't think that you can take a Beatles song and make it your own unless you're a really, really powerful and clever performer. And as much as Richard would, be ingeniously arrange and organise all these covers, I think the Beatles are just too much for anybody, really.
Their covers of other songs, and particularly the Beatles songs, are very good because they show an understanding of harmony and theory, of melody, supporting melody, and they show that, they're not scared to take a song by a very, very famous band that you think, can you ever, for instance, can you ever do a better version of Yesterday? The answer is probably not. But they were able to take some of the Beatles songs that are imprinted on people's psyche and actually do what I think is not necessarily better, but something of equal caliber, something of great interest. And it was intelligently done, and it was done with great panache.
I've often heard Richard say, it's that album you have to get out of your system. It's that album you've been waiting to make for 5 or 7 or 10 years, and you know exactly how it's got to sound, and once you're in the studio, that's how it has to come out. And that's what happened with them.
The first album was really the one that made their name. It wasn't to be their biggest seller, because of course they went on to greater success. But it did introduce that lush velveteen sound to a generation. I say a generation, probably not what we think of as the late 60s generation who are into something a bit more perhaps radical, but to the kind of the Brady Bunch generation, the slightly more kind of grown-up generation. It was what perhaps in UK we'd think of as the Radio 2 generation. They very quickly became the dominant act in that field. And they were coming along on the sort of the back of singer-songwriters like James Taylor and people like that, and that kind of easy listening sound.
So now their first album has been out for a while, it's sort of like run its course, and they need a new single. And it was either let's pull something out from this first album, or we'll try something new. So Herb said, yeah, go into the studio and try Close to You, and let's see what you come back with. So they did it, come back, they didn't like it. The company didn't like it. So take 2, they go in, and it's now just them singing on it. They're not playing on it. It's a different arrangement. It's these studio musicians. Still no good. So Richard says, all right, let me take one more crack at it. And that's when he figured out this arrangement for the song that it's almost like they had to get the other 2 out of their systems before they got to this. And it was so different from the other versions that had been recorded. It had some weight to it. Now, you don't think of Close to You, this like little fluffy pop song, as having any weight to it. But compared to what had come before, it had a little something that grabbed you.
Why do birds suddenly appear? Just like me, they long to be close to you.
It kind of summed up everything that was going to come from the Carpenters. It was a 3-way thing. It was to do with arrangements, multi-harmonies, and Karen Carpenter's voice, which was kind of a very rich voice, quite often melancholic, sometimes playful, not very often. But she just had such a range of emotion and a velvety texture to her vocal that she kind of transcended the rather old-fashioned MOR place that they were in, really.
Karen was like, it's just, why do birds suddenly appear? Like, she just waited a little. It's almost as if she knew this is a really silly song, you know, and so I'm just gonna like sing it tongue-in-cheek a little bit. And whether she was thinking that or whether that's just what came out doesn't matter, because that's how it came out, and it was great. And it's just one of those things that those vocals like grabs you right away.
On the day that you were born, the angels got together and decided to create a dream come true. So they sprinkled moon dust in your hair and golden starlight in your eyes of blue.
I think probably at the time it was criticised for being a bit twee and a bit sweet, but it's definitely stood the test of time. And the way that Karen Carpenter sings it is majestic. And it's just one of those songs, once it's in your head, you can't shake it out of your head for days on end. So partly down to Bacharach and David's songwriting craft, but also partly down to Richard Carpenter's fantastic arrangements and Karen's vocals. And that kind of then became the template for Carpenter's singles for the next few years.
We've only just begun to live. White lace and promises, a kiss for luck, and we're on our way.
That album also yielded the hit We've Only Just Begun, and that was a very interesting sequence of events, because that became a huge favourite at weddings. It became a huge favourite motto for people leaving school. It just sort of summed up the Carpenters' forthcoming career, but also summed up for many people real milestones in their lives. So they really hit lucky with that song.
Sharing horizons that are new to us, watching the signs along the way, talking it over, just the two of us, working together day to day, together.
This huge record, you know, I mean, that could have been the first record too, and it would have been just as big. And in fact, that's the one that came to be more identified with them even than Close to You. And that was, you know, whatever, as good as Close to You was, We've Only Just Begun was better. You know, the arrangement, I mean, it was an exciting record, it was a beautiful record, it was a sweet record, it was, you know, it just caught the time so well, you know, this sort of tail end of the Vietnam War in America now, and sort of that hippie generation of the late 60s is now maybe a little bit older, and some of them are still sort of like living this sort of hippie life, but some of them are like sort of going back into sort of mainstream America. And here was a record that was just perfect for mainstream America. Parents loved it. Kids, you know, especially girls in middle school, but not just girls, a lot of guys sort of secretly liked it too, you know. And it's a perfect record, We've Only Just Begun.
It established them as singer-songwriters, and it's always difficult, you know, to come from nowhere and you get your first album that's successful, and then the follow-up album, if it bombs, maybe in those days they gave you another album. Nowadays, if your second album bombs, it's Good Night Nurse and the end of it, you know. But they showed a maturity already, you know. I suppose they had legs and they were running by that point. That's the best way to describe it.
So much of life ahead. We'll find a place where there's room to grow. And yes, we've just begun.
So now, the Close to You album, those two songs were on that huge album, Grammy-winning album, selling, you know, truckloads by the truckloads. And so this third album is going to come out, and it's a little rushed. You know, they want to get it out while they're, you know, you strike while the iron is hot.
Cause breaking up is so very hard to do. If you should find you miss a sweet and tender love we used to share, go back to the places where we used to go, and I'll be there. Oh, how can I forget you when there is always something there to remind me?
They introduced the concept of the medley on this album. They had a Bacharach and David medley. Now, the medley was something the Carpenters grew to like very much. They always had medleys in their stage act. They had medleys later on in future albums, and it's actually a bit ridiculous listening back to it that a duo that were going to become so successful should actually resort to covering all these old songs.
The Bacharach medley, which was a continuation or just an offshoot of what they did at that Burt Bacharach show in 1970. And yeah, it had real zip to it. It was really good. And again, it was a real showcase for Karen's versatility because it bounced all over the place tempo-wise. And so when it picked up, she stayed with it. And then when it came time for her to sing ballady again, she could do that.
Walk on by, make believe that you don't see the tears, just let me grieve in private, 'cause each time I see you I break down and cry. Walk on by.
There were, however, 3 huge hit singles, top 3 singles, all of them. For All We Know, Rainy Days and Mondays, and Superstar, all top 3 in America. This was a really, really big period for the Carpenters in America. So I think we can overlook the medley in this case.
The new songs that were on that record were them at their absolute peak. I'm talking about Rainy Days and Mondays, Superstar, Let Me Be the One, and For All We Know. To me, that's peak Carpenters, 1971. They were pop music.
Long ago, and oh so far away, I fell in love with you before the second show.
They did the Bonnie Bramlett, Leon Russell song Superstar, and which shows that they were listening to much more rock-orientated things than perhaps you might have imagined being the Carpenters. In other words, they were very open-minded people. So their version of Superstar, it's not my favourite, but it shows once again that they can take somebody else's song and make it their own, and I think that's really important.
He heard, I think, Bette Midler singing Superstar on The Tonight Show and said, wow, this would be great for Karen, and then it happened really fast. And in comes, little Karen Carpenter from Downey, California, and delivers the definitive interpretation of the song still all these years later. And that was Richard hearing that her voice would fit in well to it and giving her the setting for it. It's a very exciting record, Superstar. I mean, it has its peaks and valleys, it slows down and it speeds up, but it's very dynamic.
Don't you remember you told me you loved me, baby? You said you'd be coming back this way again, baby. Baby, 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 oh baby, I love you.
Bette Midler's version was like a torch song. It was lustful, it was pretty open about what it was about. Other people covered it and did it the same way. When Richard took the song to Karen Carpenter, she refused to sing some of the words. So instead of being anxious to sleep with somebody again, she was anxious to be with somebody again. And she would only sing the sanitized version, which changed the whole feel of the song and turned the lyrics right around. It turned it into a young girl's romantic idol rather than the bit of filthy lust that it was, really.
Karen Carpenter brings it a real pining, sort of yearning edge, and it's beautifully poignant. And I think probably if generations of young people who've had a crush on a rock star ever since have made that song in their head about, their own song. Really great song.
Baby, oh baby, I love you. I really do.
So they're on this third album, so because these songs are such huge hits, the third album sells, as we call it the tan album. That's sort of what it's called because it was this tan cover and so it's kind of a goof on the white album. We call it the Carpenters' tan album. And so while as an album maybe it doesn't quite hang together as well as the other ones, it does have individual tracks that are them at their peak.
Talking to myself and feeling old. Sometimes I'd like to quit. Nothing ever seems to fit. Hanging around, nothing to do but frown. Rainy days and Mondays always get me down.
Although still a very big seller, Song for You didn't perhaps sell quite as much as the previous album. But a lot of that was probably just down to scheduling and timing. I mean, the Carpenters were quite prolific during their career. They were touring heavily, they were doing lots of TV specials. And they weren't just doing TV specials, they were doing lots of guest spots on other people's TV shows. And as a very accessible, family-friendly band, they were good TV fodder, so they invited onto all the major shows.
They're it. They are really the biggest act in the business now. And so you would think that this is going to put pressure on them when it's time for the next record. But Richard was very smart about how, I think in the back of his mind was always that the Tan album, they didn't have enough time. Things got too crazy at the beginning after Close to, We've Only Just Begun. They had to get a record out. He knew that he wanted to have the time to make a fuller album. And what came out was A Song for You, which is generally considered to be their most complete album.
Such a feeling's coming over me. There is wonder in most everything I see, and the reason is clear. It's because you are here. You're the nearest thing to heaven that I'll see. I'm on top of the world, looking down on creation, and the only explanation I can find.
Some people have suggested that there was a concept at work behind A Song for You, but it was a pretty ropey concept, really. The idea was that A Song for You would open and close the album, sort of bookend it, and that all the material between the bookends was the song. And it consisted of loads of songs, loads of hits on that album. It was a really successful LP, and apparently the Carpenters' own favourite of all the albums they made.
I really don't know if I can understand why it's a concept album, but it's got fantastic tracks on it, like Goodbye to Love, It's Going to Take Some Time, Top of the World. I mean, whether it's supposed to be a concept album or not, these are really good songs.
Richard and John wrote Top of the World and Goodbye to Love, which were both on that record. And there was a Carole King song. Leon Russell, who wrote Superstar, wrote the song, A Song for You. So it's their, you know, less dependence on stuff that had been lying around for a few years, or even older covers. You know, as we said, Close to You was old. I'll Never Fall in Love Again, Baby. They, you know, even the covers that they were doing were brand new. You know, that Carole King song it's Going to Take Some Time, which was just on an album that was out at the same time. You know, so it was their most complete album in that it was probably their most contemporary. It had the most new music on it, and a lot of the songs were actually about music and relationships.
So this is Goodbye to Love. Yeah, probably their biggest ballad, or they're probably most known for this song, I would think. Goodbye to Love. Anyway, so here we go. Goodbye to Love.
Goodbye to Love is just an awesome track by anybody's standards. I mean, even if at the time it was perhaps seen as a little bit over the top with the big, huge guitar solo coming in at the end, I think it's become a guilty pleasure for lots of generations since.
There's your B flat over E flat again that was in Top of the World. And then it modulates.
It builds magnificently, great lyrics, beautifully sung, beautifully arranged, and then it has to be said that that guitar solo, it may be a little bit air guitar, a little bit over the top, but it's very hard not to go along with it. This
is typical of Richard Carpenter and the way that he would put songs together, because he would have, you know, that guitar coming out of nowhere in that song. He'd another song, a flute would suddenly materialise in the middle and then disappear again, or a saxophone solo. He had these little quirky little things happening in the songs just at the point that you least expected them, in addition to his you know, his more organic arrangements and his brass and his piano and his strings and all of the vocal sounds that he put in. He just had these little things that just seemed quite surprising, really.
To me, it was the album of the year in 1972, and oddly enough, it was not. The last two were nominated for Album of the Year. This one wasn't, because probably there wasn't a huge hit single on the radio when the nominating processes were going on. You know, it was done by then. And it was, you know, Richard has often said that if he could go back, he would release the singles differently from that record, because he kept doing it the next year, and then they were huge. Like Top of the World was not released as a single for more than a year after it came out on that album, and it was one of their biggest hits. Now, if it had come out when that album was out, that album, you know, as Richard has said many times, would have sold another 1 million copies and probably would have been nominated for Album of the Year, as it should have been.
Now and Then is an interesting album because this kind of is a concept album in the sense of looking back at the 50s sounds, perhaps some of the doo-wop stuff that Richard Carpenter was very fond of. It was perhaps a little bit indulgent. Richard Carpenter was interested in kind of an earlier sound, a kind of a pre-rock sound, and he was kind of interested in the doo-wop and the very early pop. So he was kind of looking back at that Happy Days American Graffiti era and paying homage to it a little bit. It kind of worked, but I think it detracted a little bit from what the Carpenters do best, which is straightforward love songs.
I think he just wanted to have some fun with this record, and that Now and Then was just a fun record. It was different, like it changed up the formula just enough and kept all the good elements of what they had. So what they had was one side of new stuff and one side of oldies, bracketed by their song Yesterday Once More, which was really the song that broke them worldwide.
If you look at this piece of music, chordally, it's really quite complicated, but it works musically. Also, it's very much of the time as well. You know, music is like that. You know, there's periods in you know, if you go back to Miles Davis or something like that, there's very much, the chord sequences and the structures are of that era. And this is very much late 60s, early 70s. You know, it's sort of, they're moving the boundaries of possibilities of pop songs, and they're bringing in, as I said, all these different influences. And you'll hear this in just the chord structure here. Because it's quite complicated, I can't really talk you through the chord structure, except to say really that it starts in E at the beginning of the song, and the chorus ends up being basically in E. But it moves around to get back to the original key, and that's a really clever thing. That's a good songwriter. So the ear has already got accustomed to the sound of the chorus.
Yesterday Once More perhaps defines the album Now and Then because it's pretty much a manifesto. It's looking back at you know, sounds that they used to listen to, sounds that moved them when they were kids, when they were listening to music and learning about music. And as very good musicians, they were probably studying these sounds and studying the way records were put together, which is why Richard Carpenter is such a good arranger and producer.
Horizon must have come as a bit of a surprise to the Carpenters because for the first time they did not go multi-platinum, they just went platinum. Now I know a lot of bands would love to go platinum, but at their level that must have been quite a serious problem.
Horizon perhaps was slightly disappointing by the standards of some of the albums that have gone before, I think. It's still sold well, it's still very popular, but perhaps the formula, the Carpenters formula, was just starting to become over-familiar at this point. They were obviously they were sticking to the formula that worked, but perhaps they were just a little overexposed. They were, still touring heavily, working hard. It was this overworking that led to Karen's sad demise indirectly. And perhaps it was kind of just a by numbers Carpenters album, that one. It has great moments on it. Obviously, technique-wise, it's still excellent, but perhaps they were just kind of getting a little bit tired, and they needed a little break at this point.
Just the pressure of being on top, for so long. How do you keep repeating that? And I think it just got to both of them after a while. They had no private lives really to speak of. Up until a year before Horizon, they were still living with their parents, So they just had no time to just sort of, even that year when they didn't put out an album, they were still like touring a lot, So they just didn't seem very happy. And you sort of look at that picture of them, I don't know if you know the album cover of Horizon, but the looks on their faces are just so lost. And it came through in the music.
Only yesterday when I was sad and I was lonely, you showed me the way to leave the past and all its tears behind me. Tomorrow may be even brighter than today. I threw my sadness away. Only yesterday.
A Kind of Hush continued as the slight downward spiral that they were on. It didn't go platinum, it went gold only, and that's quite serious really for the Carpenters. Again, their choice of covers is becoming really questionable. A Herman's Hermit song, like a little breezy little pop song from the 60s, doesn't necessarily sit that well as a Carpenters song. And it just seemed that their lights were dimming or something. There was just a feel of scratching around, slightly desperate feel about that. They should have been seeking out really good material from other songwriters instead of these incessant covers that they did.
Of lovers in love, you know what I mean? It's the two of us and nobody else. It's like there's nobody else. I'm feeling good, just holding you tight.
It was a mistake to put out to record A Kind of Hush, another oldie, another 10-year-old song. Again, the record had some nice moments on it, but there wasn't quite any magic there. Horizon had a little magic to it. A Kind of Hush was just quiet. It was an appropriate title, and maybe they needed to take another year off or just sort of reassess what was going on in pop music at the time, because they could still do it, but it was just a little lackluster.
There's a kind of all over the world, right? All over the world, people just like us are falling in love.
They did it with customary style, it was very slick and so forth, but perhaps the kind of the AOR generation was starting to be usurped by things like disco and even punk rock were coming along now. In the States, perhaps punk rock wasn't as commercially valid as it was in the UK, but disco was certainly a phenomenon, and the radio stations were starting to lean towards more up-tempo sounds, different acts, newer acts. It's inevitable really, with every few years new acts come along and take over the radio play, but the Carpenters were struggling to have the domination or the stranglehold on the charts and the radio that they had had.
All over the world, right? All over the world, you hear the sounds of lovers in love. Yeah, lovers in love. All over the world.
With Passage, which was released in 1977, the decline continued really. That didn't even go gold, couldn't make the 500,000 mark in America in terms of sales. It was clearly some sort of effort to reverse the downward trend that they'd been experiencing. Didn't disco was getting really very big at the time. The Carpenters were sounding a little bit out of date by now, and I think it was their attempt to kind of present some sort of more experimental side of themselves to the public.
Perhaps, you know, Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind had been very popular around this time, hugely popular, of course. And Richard was influenced by these and thought, I know, let's do a science fiction influenced album. And this resulted, of course, in the classic Calling Occupants of Interplanetary Craft, one of the most over-the-top, mad pop singles of all time. And from being this very safe band, the Carpenters suddenly turned into these kind of astral cosmic hippies.
When I heard it, I went, wow, this is really, have they been taking drugs? What have they been doing? Because it's really quite spacey and quite dreamlike. And there's even a sort of reference to Axis Bolded Love, Hendrix in the beginning with the spaceship and space people, you know, that sort of talking thing about on the radio. It's the same thing. Had they been listening to Axis Bolded Love? I don't know. But the body of the track, I mean, the beginning is a little crass. It's not quite as groovy as Hendrix's idea of spaceships and space people. But I think as a song, it works really well.
It should have been bigger. It should have been a bigger record. And it would have been if they were more in favor at the time. And the fact that it almost was a hit, you could feel it sort of clawing its way. It almost made it. And then stopped.
It didn't really suit the Carpenters, and there was calypso on this album, and there was pop, and it was just a little bit of everything and not enough of something solid.
The pressure, perhaps, of constant work was starting to take its toll, most infamously, of course, on Karen, who was beginning to get very tired, starting to develop what turned out to be anorexia and bulimia.
The Carpenters took a bit of time out after Passage and before recording what would turn out to be their last album. They had personal problems of their own to try and work on. Karen was actually becoming quite ill by this point. She had anorexia, but her weight problems had dated right back to the days of Spectrum, when she was a fairly chubby person and first went to the doctor about her weight. Richard, meanwhile, had been taking Quaaludes as an aid to sleeping at night. And in 1976, he suddenly realised that he was taking them as a routine now and not as an occasional help to a good night's sleep. And he realised that he had a big problem with them. But he let that problem continue for 3 years before he really confronted it. And it wasn't until January 1979 that he went into rehab and fought the demons. So he then took the next 11 months off to kind of just rest up and recuperate and get healthy and get over the rehab and the years of Quaalude abuse.
Made in America, I think, is one of the least well-remembered, probably, Carpenters albums. If I remember correctly, it didn't sell as well as some of the previous ones, and this was perhaps one too many too soon. Again, with the Carpenters, you never fault the quality. It's not like there's ever a Carpenters album where you go, oh, listen to this is disastrous. They're playing wrong, they're singing wrong. Of course, no, technically they're always great craftsmen and craftspeople. But it lacked spark, it lacked inspiration, I think. And they needed to recharge their batteries. Perhaps that would have been wise.
It's a really painful record to listen to. It was then, and it even is more so now. You know, one of Richard's contentions about the solo record is that Karen was not well enough to be recording and to be flying back, and he's absolutely right about that. But the same thing was true about Made in America. Her vocals are just so light, and compared with what she'd done 10 years earlier, kind of insubstantial.
Suddenly appear every time you are near, just like me, they long to be close to you.
this whole downward slide they were on was really, I think, unstoppable by this point. There was just nothing they could do. I think they'd exhausted their energies. I think they'd just run out of ideas. It just wasn't a very good album. There's nothing really striking about it. There's nothing on it that people would talk about today if you had a conversation about the Carpenters.
With hindsight, of course, we now know that Karen wasn't well, and I think that was obviously showing. Although I don't even know if Richard and Karen knew it, if you know what I mean. And it was, what, 1981, and she was dead 2 years later, at 32 years old. I mean, it's very tragic, you know, because I think the thing is that if it was nowadays, perhaps there would have been more understanding and therefore more possibilities of help. But I think nobody understood what was happening, nobody understood why she was suffering from an eating disorder, and therefore didn't know what to do about it. I mean, she died at her parents' home. You know, she just didn't wake up, you know, because her heart stopped.
I don't know if anybody expected her to die suddenly like she did, but I think that anyone would have been worried to see the photographs of how thin, how desperately thin she looked in the last years of her life. She was very, very seriously underweight, skeletal. So it would have come as no surprise, I expect, to fans to learn that she had been anorexic. It would have been sad for them to discover that she had been trying to do something very seriously to deal with it and had actually put a little bit of weight on at the time she died. But the cause of death was actually from a heart attack, triggered by years and years of erratic eating patterns and unhealthy food when she did eat, and just putting too much strain on her body, and her heart just gave out, and so she died in February 1983, and it's a great pity.
Since Karen's death, Richard has he did eventually release some sort of outtakes and, you know, previous outtakes with Karen's voice on that he put together and polished up and did release. Since then, he's done some solo work. A lot of it's kind of piano based, and he isn't really trying to emulate the Carpenters. He has enough respect to leave that alone, and he does his own thing. You know, obviously a very good pianist, etc. But I don't think anyone would say that the records approach the magic of the Carpenters.
He hasn't really become a big star in his own right. And I think he's probably okay with that. But he has really done a good job of keeping the Carpenters' legacy alive.
Seems to fit, hanging around, nothing to do but frown. Rainy days and Mondays always get me down.
Since Karen died, he has become the keeper of the flame, and he's putting out compilations, and he's remixing stuff, and he's constantly working on previously unreleased material and keeping himself really busy that way. And he has, with his wife, become a patron of the arts also. So he's doing his best to keep the flag flying.
We've only just begun to live, white lace and promises, a kiss for luck and